Hi there, Otto Curioso with you here today. This is a place for quirky cars, interesting stories, and most importantly, an exceptionally bad filmmaking. I promise I'm working on that. Please give me some time. Today we're doing something different. We're inside my house and I'm wearing a hat. I'm wearing a hat because never trust your siblings with your haircut. And we're inside my house because I don't have any car for you to review today. We're currently in quarantine and it's a little bit difficult to get hold of a car. Regardless, I do have a very interesting story to share with you today. It's about Russian Mafia and the cars they drove. I strongly believe that Russian Mafia started in 1991. After the fall of the USSR. Of course, there was criminality before, but with collapse of the USSR, everybody was for themselves. There was even a new term that came up, which was Novy Ruski, which literally translates to New Russian. And this Russian was not a communist anymore. He was a capitalist, and he or she wanted to get rich as fast as possible and by any means. And this was sort of what was going in 1991. In 90s, the criminality just went through the roof. It was kind of crazy. So when the USSR collapsed, the way you could make money was through importing other goods to Russia and other communist countries. Clothes, maybe some food, furniture, and as well as cars. Most of the time, if you wanted to run your business, you needed to have some sort of protection. And this is what happened. You sort of speak to your Russian mafia gangster, whoever controls that business, and they provide you with the necessary protection. If you do not agree, or perhaps you do not wish to pay them, they could literally come to, whether it's your shop on the market, they would just, butcher the shop, or even if you have, a factory for, let's say, meat products or even cars, they can come to the factory and just take it over. Racketeering was honestly through the roof. And these sort of gangsters, they drove very interesting cars that we'll come to talk about. But prior to that, I want to talk about the cars that the Russian folk was driving in Soviet Union. It was your regular VAZ 2101, Kopeyka, Восьмерка, Семерка, Девятка, Volga, Niva. Volga was driven by either governmental entities or directors, or perhaps even KGB had the ones with the V8, and Chaika was made especially for heads of state, like your Khrushchev and who else. This was a limousine that was especially made for them. While in the 80s we were driving these cars, just over there in Italy, we had Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Alfa Romeos. In Germany, we had Mercedes, Porsche, BMW. Overseas, in America, people drove their big Lincolns and SUVs and whatnot. Even Japan, this was an era of turbocharged cars. Japan had really, really cool cars back then. And Soviet people really didn't. So a gangster who just made money, the first thing he wanted to do is get a cool car. And this is how it all came about. I mean, there were imported cars in Russia. They were called Inamarki. Inamarki is, it's literally a car that's imported from somewhere else. It was made somewhere else, not by the Russian folks. A lot of, rich people, celebrities, big businessmen, governmental individuals, they did have like some Mercedes, some BMWs, and some cars. Also, embassies, ambassadors could have their own cars. So you did see, sort of, interesting cars back then, but it was really a rarity. And even if you were rich to have a car like that, Communist Party did not like you to show off your wealth, so most of the time you kept it in the garages. In fact, Yuri Gagarin, first man in space, got, I believe it's called Mantra. It's a French sports car. He got it in 60s. Because he's a hero. He's the first man on in space, and I believe he got away with it. He got away, and the way the Mantra looked, I mean, a Russian kid seeing that car back in the day was probably something crazy. You could expect seeing an alien rather than a car like that. So there were sort of rankings in the Russian Mafia, and the lowest ones. So there were like the little gangsters. Then there were the gangsters who sort of made it already. They were known. They had money. Then there were the bodyguards of the big boss, and then of course there was the big boss. And accordingly, they drove different cars. So let's start with the lowest gangsters. They most of the time drove Devyatka or Vasmyorka, VAZ 2108 and VAZ 2109. It was a 2-door and a 4-door hatchback, and it was sort of the newest car that was made in the USSR. It was quite nimble. It was very cheap to buy, very cheap to run. It was nimble to drive through the small streets, and especially the 4-door was more popular with the little gangsters, is because they could easily get in and get out. The car, you can sort of compare it to something like a Golf GTI of the Soviet people. Of course, it was not nearly as good as Golf GTI. Another Russian car that Russian gangsters used to drive was Volga. Volga is a big executive sedan of the Russian people. It was driven by directors, it was driven by policemen, it was driven by various managers, and even the V8 versions were driven by the secret KGB services. It was a big sedan, and gangsters do need big sedans. And it was also very cheap to run, very cheap to buy, and you can sort of compare it to Mercedes E or even an S-Class of that era. Of course, it was nothing like that, but later on they changed. This was in the beginning of the 90s when they were still waiting to import cars from abroad. The cars that they imported from abroad were quite interesting. One of them was, in fact, Audi A80. In the beginning of the 90s, Audi A80 was very popular with Russian gangsters because it was also quite small, quite nimble, it was quite economical, and it was quite durable. I wouldn't expect A80 to be driven by Russian gangsters, but in fact, surprisingly, it was very popular with them. Then there were the guys that wanted to be like the American gangsters, and most of the time they drove the big Lincoln town cars. Yes, it sounds kind of crazy seeing a Lincoln at that time in Russia, but it used to happen. And people there absolutely loved it because they were quite powerful. The engines were reliable enough to take up Russian petrol, which is absolutely horrible, and at the same time they were very big, spacious, and they were very heavy and strong. So if you do ram another car, or if you get into a car accident, most of the time you can escape without any bruises. And these sort of things used to happen. They used to ram each other. Now the guys, so in St. Petersburg, closer to Scandinavia, drove, and I swear to God, this is not a joke, they drove Volvo 940, both sedan and estate versions, and they absolutely loved it. It was a car that was built like a tank. It was very spacious, very comfortable, and at the same time, the turbocharged versions were very, very quick at that time. Russian folk coming from 1.3 liter, Russian engine to like a 2 or 2.5 liter Scandinavian, turbocharged Volvo. their heads were blown. And we associate Volvo 940 with geography teachers, but in Russia it had different sort of audience. So after the Russian guy made some money, he wanted to upgrade his car, and a car that was very, very popular with the Russian Mafia was in fact a BMW E34. BMW E34, black on black, is still associated with the Russian gangsters. They absolutely loved it. Back in the day, if you did see a black or any 5 series E34, do not come next to it, because most of the time that guy is a gangster. And you cannot blame them, because even today E34 looks absolutely stunning. It handles very well. Its engines are something that dreams are made of, and they were quite durable. This is very important at that time for Russia, because you couldn't easily get spare parts. The petrol was terrible, and at the same time they were driven into the ground. It's not like they really took care of those cars. No, there were pursuits from either you're pursuing a guy who owns you, or you're running away from somebody. Things were crazy back then. Now, if you did not like E34, if you did not like BMW, those guys went for Mercedes W124. W124, at that time was like the most durable Mercedes you can buy. It was very popular with the taxi drivers. Even when the next generation came out, they still prefer the W124. And it was very popular with the Russian gangsters. After the legendary E34, people switched to E39 5 Series. And again, you cannot blame them. It's the best looking sedan ever made. It handles absolutely amazing, and of course it was not as reliable as the E34, not as durable, but again, it was there at the end of the 90s. This was when the Russian gangsters stopped being so hardcore, and they were sort of easing down and calming down. Now on to the bodyguard cars, the SUVs that were going in convoy with the big boss and protecting them. There were different sort of cars. It all began with the Jeep Grand Cherokee. Yes, a car that was driven by a housewife, for school runs back in America, was then shipped to Russia, where very serious guys used to do very serious things. Jeep, when it was fully, by the way, all the cars were fully black. They were murdered out, they were fully tinted, and the big SUVs always had like a big metal bull bar. And they used to use those bull bars for a reason, because whenever there's a strelka, as I mentioned, it's when the gangsters come to sort out things. You might have an ambush, and if you do, you have your SUV car that can ram other cars, and your big boss can get away. And people absolutely love Jeep. Even today in Russia or Russian speaking countries, if you mention Jeep, this could be any SUV. Another car that was very popular more to the north, north and eastern of Russia, was the Land Cruiser 80. People absolutely loved Land Cruiser 80, but it was not as fast, and didn't have the V8, the big V8 that the Grand Cherokee had. But it was super durable. Another very important car that was used by Russian gangsters were in fact the big Chevy SUVs. So the Blazers, the Tahoes, and the Suburbans. The big Suburbans were very popular because you can put like 9 big guys in there, ammunition, guns, everything you need, And the V8, like the size and everything, was very, very scary back then. It's a car that, like, if you see that car with people inside, don't deal with those people. They're not very nice guys. Now, the most surprising SUV that was used by Russian gangsters is, I'm gonna give you 5 seconds to guess. It was a Japanese SUV, not a Land Cruiser. I'm counting to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was a Mitsubishi Pajero. A car I owned at some point. I owned a Mitsubishi Pajero, and I could not just believe that a gangster could own this car. But in fact, it was the most popular SUV car amongst the Russian gangsters because, first of all, they're very reliable. They were very economical, and if you do have an ambush, you want to drive away, it matters. You want to have a reliable and economical car so you can go for long distances. They were spacious, and most importantly, at that time, Mitsubishi won the Dakar Rally. The cars were very, very durable. They used to be very, very nimble on the off-road, compared to your Grand Cherokees and Suburbans. And it used to have the, futuristic off-road technology. One of them was the Selective Transmission, where you can change the drive line between two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive on speeds up to 100 kilometers an hour. And it sounds sort of crazy, but Pajero was a gangster car. So after the beginning of the 90s, close to late 90s, early 2000s, the convoy cars were mostly consisting of Land Cruiser 100, LC100, that substituted LC80. But people, they loved Land Cruiser 100 way more than the Land Cruiser 80 because it's a way better car. Land Cruiser 100 used absolutely by everybody. They were used as convoy cars for the big gangsters. They were used as the governmental cars instead of the Volgas. Special forces, Berkut, used to use those cars to catch those Russian gangsters. It's because Land Cruiser 100 is one of the most reliable cars in the world, and for these sort of things you do need a car that's very reliable, very durable, and that can go anywhere. And at the same time, you can fit like up to 8 people in there. Today, even today, everybody absolutely loves Land Cruiser 100. Another car you probably forgot that I will mention is definitely the Mercedes G Wagon. G Wagon, it's a car that probably mostly associated with gangsters and Russian Mafia. It's sort of very stereotypical for Russian Mafia gangster to drive a G Wagon, fully blacked and everything on it. And they absolutely did. Even up until today, the tough guys drive Mercedes G-Class. Why? I do not know. One person once mentioned that they drive them because it's a square shape and it reminds them of the jail cell. Jail cell that most of the gangsters, they were in jail at one point in time. And the Russian jails, they're sort of there's like hard metal doors and everything is square, sort of like the G Wagon. So maybe that's why they drive them, maybe that's why they like them. But at that time, they were the perfect convoy cars. They were not as reliable and as comfortable as the Land Cruiser, but they looked kind of cool and they were tough. They were the very, very good cars for Russian gangsters that even up until today it's still stuck. The car is always associated with the Russian gangsters. Now on to the big boss cars. They were the cars where most of the time the big boss used to drive at the back. They were for the biggest gangsters there were. And you probably already guessed what cars were they. But it all started with the BMW 7 Series E32. E32, when it came out, it was very revolutionary back then. You know, it had the technology that at that time Mercedes or even the American cars, I'm not even talking about Japanese, didn't have. And the E32 had it. But later down the line, E32 was replaced with BMW E38. And come on, I mean, even today, E38 looks absolutely stunning. It's, you know, it's the best looking sedan after E39, is the best looking sedan ever made. Everybody absolutely loves E38. There's even a movie, a Russian movie called Boomer. This is what they call Beamers. Boomer. It's a movie about four Russian, you know, gangsters. They stole the E38 750 before the restyling, and it was fully black, you know, black interior, black everything, and they were sort of getting away from people chasing them, and everybody absolutely loved that movie, and nobody can say anything bad about E38 in those countries, because if you do, you might get punched in the face. People respect E38. Now on to the big boss. It's a car that was loved by absolutely everyone. At that time, Mercedes, yes, the Mercedes S-Class W140 was ruling the world. It was driven and ridden by everybody. Politicians used to use it, gangsters used to use it, different businessmen used to use it. W140 is the most cursed car in the Mercedes history. They were shot at, they were blown up, they were, you know, no good things were happening in W140. And there is a reason for that. At that time, you know, Mercedes, you know, totally revolutionized the luxury car. The cars were very safe, they were very reliable, they were very comfortable, and they were luxurious. They were both very tough. Even today they say, you know, W140 was the last, you know, proper tough Mercedes built. And Russian gangsters absolutely loved it, especially the V12 version. So after the German guy, the capitalist who was living his capitalist life, you know, businessman, made some good money, bought an S600. You know, after a couple of years, he wanted to get rid of it because the car was, you know, it's a big engine, V12, and it probably costs a lot to maintain. And they willingly shipped it to the Russian guys. And imagine the Russian guy who used to drive, you know, all those Volgas and, you know, Zhiguli and Vaz and everything. You know, once they made money, they went all out, and they really, like, most of them got the S600. It was absolutely amazing. Even today, the car is absolutely amazing. It still looks good. It's the king. Mercedes-Benz is the king. W140 is the king of all the Mercedes. And yeah, that was pretty much it. And even when the W220 came out later on in the late 90s, 1998, people did switch to them, but later on, you know, they found out like they were cheated, and they went back to W140. And W140 was called as Kaban, which means like a wild pig, the hog. It was called Rubel Sorak. 600 SL was called Chistisote. And yeah, I mean, the car and Russian Mafia, W140 and Russian Mafia go like this together. And not only Russian Mafia, even Yakuzas absolutely love W140. They literally bow to W140 because at that time it was the greatest car you can think about. Thank you guys very much. I hope you like this video. Please share, comment, like, and subscribe. If you like the video, please let me know. I can do some more of it. If you see a place where I can improve, please tell me so I can improve and provide you with a better content. Thank you very much and stay safe.